There are many people now sitting around in their own lives, in their own homes, not telling the person that's across the table from them what they really think about the world. And the more of us that do that, we actually are giving air to the monster that is coming for all of us.
So ultimately, what does this come down to? Rebuilding families, educating our children, retaking control over the educational institutions that have been indoctrinating them for generation after generation. It starts at the dinner table at the end of the day.
We have a very weak Republican legislature that lacks even a small group of people who are willing to stand up to woke corporate mandates. And it doesn't matter if it's mandatory CRT in the workplace. It doesn't matter if it's mandatory vaccination to be employed in the state of Florida. It doesn't matter if it's banning social media censorship. We have Republicans that are just too weak to stand up.
Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
Yaakov Pollak here, Florida-based reporter for Rebel News, and over the weekend I was at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida. The event brings together public figures, journalists, thinkers, and students here in one of the freest places in the world right now to discuss how to return to traditional conservatism and the best way to unite the nation, but also create cultural and economic prosperity. I ran into some prominent thinkers on the right side of the aisle. Here's what they had to say.
Literally 5 years ago, believe it or not, I was a Bernie Sanders supporter. You can boo if you want, that's fine. But I was. You can see videos of it on YouTube. And here I am at the National Conservatism Conference. And not only am I here, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm actually very excited to be here. You just must start saying what you think. It is really that simple, and although that doesn't sound very comfortable or fun, it is better than the alternative. There are many people now sitting around in their own lives, in their own homes, not telling the person that's across the table from them what they really think about the world. And the more of us that do that, we actually are giving air to the monster that is coming for all of us. It is thriving on the fact that we are afraid to fight. The generations, from an American and a Canadian perspective, the generations that came before us had to live through a lot more, right? Plenty of Canadians fought and died in World War II. Obviously, plenty of Americans fought and died in World War II. And it's like now we've got people who exist on Twitter and still are afraid to say what they think. And the more that we do that, we are handing our enemy something that we will not get back so easily.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, well, we've seen not only at every level of society, be it in woke capital, big tech, obviously parts of the federal government, state governments, and beyond, we've seen this sort of malaise, this slide into a reflexively anti-American position, which I would argue, and I've argued before, is this virtue signaling is sort of born of a moral narcissism. And in some sense, it's to absolve our elites, I think, at a deep level, playing psychoanalyst here, of their perceived sins. What we need to rekindle is confidence about the foundations of this country, its mission, its core values and principles. It starts with inculcating them in our children, and naturally, of course, that's why one of the biggest areas that the left has targeted in its long march over the last century plus was, of course, the schools. And I think we see this fight happening right now down at the local levels when it comes to critical race theory and parents who are engaged in terms of what their children are actually learning. If there's one perverse silver lining to what we've seen during the coronavirus, it's the fact that parents got an in-depth view as to the indoctrination their children are being subjected to at far too many schools across this country, essentially creating generation after generation of social justice warriors and woke warriors and worse. So ultimately, what does this come down to? Rebuilding families, educating our children, retaking control over the educational institutions that have been indoctrinating them for generation after generation. It starts at the dinner table at the end of the day.
Heroes of Liberty is a new book series for children, illustrated biographies, stunningly illustrated biographies, I should say, of different heroes of liberty. It's aimed at American children as young as, I would say, between 4 and 11 probably. And each book tells the personal story of an American hero. We have Thomas Sowell, Amy Coney Barrett, Ronald Reagan, and there's much more to come. John Wayne, Abraham Lincoln, and even Margaret Thatcher, who's not an American, but she is definitely a hero of liberty. And each one of these bigger than life figures represents in his own or her own life journey. They embody American values. If it's Ronald Reagan with determination, Amy Coney Barrett with values of family, and Thomas Sowell with self-reliance and responsibility, and the value of education and pushing yourself.
It's one of the better governors out there, absolutely. We hope he continues to do what he does, and there are a few things we like to see him do beyond what he's doing right now. You know, for example, he is not clamping down on corporations mandating vaccines or masks for their employees. We do hope he changes his mind on that. We do hope he follows State Representative Anthony Sabatini's lead to enact such legislation, and he'll be even more favorable if he does.
I'm running for Congress because our country's in really bad shape. If you still think we really are still a country, we might not be. We actually might just be the residue of what was once a very good country.
We have a very weak Republican legislature that lacks even a small group of people who are willing to stand up to woke corporate mandates. And it doesn't matter if it's mandatory CRT in the workplace. It doesn't matter if it's mandatory vaccination to be employed in the state of Florida. It doesn't matter if it's banning social media censorship. We have Republicans that are just too weak to stand up to the new threats to liberty in our society. And they're working against Governor DeSantis. They're working against me. They're working against the people who vote and work here in the state of Florida that expect their legislature to protect their liberty. And it's time to really clean house and get rid of these weak Republicans. The Speaker of the House in Florida is really a do-nothing, moderate Republican who's really part of the reason why our state and our country just continues to drift leftward. He's a very close friend of Jeb Bush. He's an acolyte of the old school Republican mentality, which lacks the courage to stand up to woke corporate mandates and the new sort of identity politics that the left has been pushing really hard. And he just fails miserably to do that. And so he just gets played again and again, gets rolled again and again by the left. And we need courageous people who understand the threats that these big woke companies represent, both towards, our private healthcare decisions, our educational model, just our ability to have any constitutional liberty and to be a constitution, a self-governing constitutional republic. We are losing that rapidly because we have weak Republicans who don't understand what's happening in society right now. And he's the best example of that, the Speaker of the House in Florida.
I hold to the same view that Lincoln did, which is America will never truly be destroyed from without. We ultimately are in control of our own fate. And one of the things that I talked about in my remarks was the fact that, China is modernizing militarily, making rapid technological advances, obviously growing, even if it's cooking the books, at a substantial rate economically, and it's clearly deathly serious about becoming first the regional hegemon and then the global hegemon. The problem we face is that, unlike, say, during the Cold War, our fate is in some respects inextricably intertwined with Communist China. We are so thoroughly integrated with Communist China, which instead of closing itself off to the world, opened itself up in what I argued has been the greatest influence operation of all time, which is to develop inroads in every single strategically significant power center in America and throughout the world. Consequently, being able to ultimately, down the road, potentially dominate without ever firing a shot because our elites, in large part, are already on the other side, so to speak, on this question. So we have the issue of our elites being tied into and thus ripe for being subverted by and, of course, submitting to Communist China. And we see this kowtowing at every level of our society. And then you have the fact that there's kind of a woke anti-cultural revolution going on right now, which divides the country and really threatens to turn us into an unrecognizable country. So I would argue at the highest level, China's strengthening and we are at each other's throats as a nation. We're not awake as a country. broadly to that threat, at least in our power centers, certainly not. And then we're divided at home with many at the upper echelons of our society preaching the same anti-American sort of rhetoric that we would hear out of the CCP.
This Rumble Locals merger, I think, is the first real assault on big tech in a concrete way. With the infrastructure that Rumble has, we know we're not going to get kicked offline. With the tech that Locals has and the ability to give that power of community building and video and audio and live streaming and all of these things to the creators, we are going to start taking the power away from big tech, putting it back in your pocket as the creator, as the consumer, because otherwise you're just the product, and that's not the business that we're in.
To hear the other side of the story, please go to rebelnews.com to never miss an update.